So our next presenter is Dr. Michael Mann. He's a distinguished professor of atmospheric science and director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center. Michael has a long CV, but what I picked out to say about you is that you were selected by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology. And you made the Bloomberg News list of 50 most influential people in 2013, which is very impressive. So with that, Michael, would you like to come?
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. I want to thank Senator Whitehouse and his staff and the other participants in today's event for helping make this come together. There is something, to me, that's quite poignant about talking about the issue of climate change in a state like Rhode Island, which is on the front lines both of the impacts of climate change and on the effort to do something about it. So it's very exciting to be speaking here today. I will be talking about this book that we wrote 2 years ago. It came out in late summer 2016, a book about climate change denial, co-authored between myself and Tom Toles, who is the cartoonist for the Washington Post. And Tom, over the years, has really engaged in some of the hardest hitting commentary about climate change and climate change denial on the pages of the Washington Post in the form of his brilliant cartoons. And so when I had the opportunity to collaborate with him on this effort, I jumped at it. And so this book came out, a book about climate change denial, and we talk about the science and the impacts and then get into the politics and why we haven't yet acted on this problem to the extent we need to. I guess that there was something prescient about publishing before the last presidential election a book about climate change based entirely on cartoons, or based mostly on cartoons. There's some words as well, because of course we had no way of knowing that we would have a chief executive who's most likely to learn something from cartoons. But it didn't work. It doesn't seem to have worked, and so I've lowered my standards a little bit. Climate change denial in the age of Trump. The paperback edition of the book just came out earlier this month, and there's a new chapter because, of course, we had to update the book after the last election. Well, I've aimed my efforts even lower now. I did co-author a children's book about climate change. It's aimed really at 5 to 10-year-olds. So I'm hoping maybe we've hit the sweet spot here for educating Washington, D.C. about this problem. So we start out talking about science. How does it work? Too often we see climate change deniers try to present themselves as modern-day Galileos, railing against the establishment. Well, there's a wonderful quote from Carl Sagan, one of my personal heroes, a great scientist, a great communicator. And as he once said, the fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus, they laughed at Fulton, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at the Bozo the Clown. And I think a number of us in this room probably remember Bozo the Clown. And here's the problem. For every true Galileo, there are thousands of Bozo the Clowns. And too often today, they have the megaphone when it comes to our larger public discourse over human-caused climate change. And we'll see some examples of that a little bit later. So the basics here, yeah, we don't have 100% certainty about the details of climate change. We don't have 100% certainty about gravity. We've still not measured the fundamental particle. I start out as a theoretical physicist. We still haven't measured the fundamental particle of gravity, the graviton. So you could say there's uncertainty. There's some pretty important uncertainties when it comes to the theory of gravity. That doesn't make it safe to jump off a cliff, does it? And yet there are those who would have us jump off the metaphorical cliff of not acting on climate change based on the same levels of uncertainty. Why should we care? It's not just about polar bears and penguins. I care about polar bears and penguins. very Gold eloquently said, this is about the sort of planet that we want to leave behind for our children and grandchildren, and I want to leave behind a planet with the same beauty and wonder as the planet I grew up on. But it's about everything. It's about unprecedented droughts that obviously impact our agriculture, impact national security. The national security community is pointing to the fact that an unprecedented drought in Syria, for example, is part of the underlying factors that have led to the instability that we see today in the Middle East, the Syrian uprising. That happened in the context of an epic drought, the worst drought on record. And when I say worst drought on record, as far back as the paleoclimate scientists can go, they tell us at least 900 years. They can go back 1,200 years in California. They tell us the drought that California has experienced in recent years, the worst in at least 1,200 years. And so there are deep national security implications for our societal infrastructure, record wildfires that we've seen out in California. For example, denial. There is still denial about the reality and threat of climate change. In Washington, D.C., within the office or chief executive, and it often goes like this. The first, there are these various stages of denial. It's not happening. We set 3 consecutive records, 2014, 2015, 2016. The critics say, oh, well, that sort of thing that can happen naturally, right? Records happen naturally. Stovetop temperatures change all the time. It could be natural. There's nothing to worry about here for these 2 frogs. We actually published a study estimating how likely you would see those 3 consecutive record-breaking years in the absence of human-caused climate change. And I could read the abstract to you and discuss the p-values and the statistical testing procedures, but I'm just going to put up the headline that Discover magazine used here to summarize our conclusions. The record global warming streak, snowball's chance in hell that this was natural. I would agree with that assessment of our findings. Well, the it's natural argument, we see it today, sea level rise. Some of you may have seen this headline about a month ago or so. Congressman who says rocks tumbling into the ocean causing sea level rise. And within days after that particular episode, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. The sea is rising, but not because of climate change. To me, that's like saying that the continents are moving, but it's not because of plate tectonics, or objects are falling, but it's not because of gravity. It's sort of on the same footing as those assertions. And we replied with a letter to the editor, as did Senator Whitehouse. And both of our letters appeared about a week later in the Wall Street Journal, where we explained the fundamental underlying science. And yes, there are ice shelves that are now breaking off that are larger than the state of Rhode Island. I just wanted to mention that. And there's lots of other evidence that we are experiencing unprecedented decay now of the ice sheets. And that's very alarming, because once those ice sheets start to go, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop. And you commit yourself not just to feet of sea level rise, not just inches that we've seen, or feet like we're likely to see within the next few decades, but we're talking 20, 30 feet of sea level rise ultimately. And you can imagine if high tide causes a loss of 4% of Rhode Island's surface area, you can imagine what 6, 7, 8, let alone 20 feet of sea level rise will do. And I know at least one person read our letter to the editor because he was sitting next to me on the flight that I was on that day. And you can see his letter to the editor by us and Sheldon Whitehouse there as well. A few days later, The Hill, the same individual, Fred Singer, sort of the granddaddy of climate change denial, an all-purpose denier, worked for the tobacco industry, worked for the chemical industry. Today, he's funded by the fossil fuel industry to attack the science of climate change. And so he was sort of doing the rounds, publishing his op-ed in any venue that would take it. The Hill published a similar op-ed from him a week later. We wrote a reply to that as well. And on the day that our reply came out, there were 3 studies that came out in the journal Nature about Antarctic ice sheet collapse, one of which indicated that Antarctica is melting 3 times faster now than it was a decade ago. It seemed to sort of put an exclamation mark on our reply to this ridiculous op-ed by Fred Singer. So no, it's not self-correcting. The effects of sea level rise, it's not a good thing. These are various lines of denial. Sorry, Scott Pruitt, sorry first that you're gone. Actually, I'm not at all sorry that you're gone. But sorry, but actually global warming is not good. It's not a good thing. Why is it not a good thing? It's really not hard to explain anymore, is it? Unprecedented superstorms and droughts and floods and wildfires and heat waves. If you think that's a good thing, if you think a mega hurricane wiping out Puerto Rico, if you think that's a good thing, then maybe climate change is a good thing. These are called just from the headlines today. Okay, the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. All you have to do is look at the day's headlines and you'll see them. Heat wave scorches Sweden as wildfires rage in the Arctic Circle. That's not a typical thing. The Arctic Circle doesn't usually experience widespread wildfires, but the unprecedented heat and drought is causing that. Japan saw unprecedented deadly floods. We've got a mega heat wave building up in the US right now. All around the planet, we are experiencing a planetary heat wave this summer. Records falling all over the northern hemisphere where it is summer. The impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We're seeing them play out in real time. And then the final stage of denial, well, okay, but it's too late to do anything about it anyway. And fortunately, that is not true. There is still time to avert the worst impacts of climate change, but as our own work, we published an article last year demonstrating that there may be 40% less carbon that's left to burn than we thought if we are to avert 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 Fahrenheit warming of the planet, which many scientists say is where we really start to see the worst and potentially irreversible impacts of climate change. It's a red line we certainly don't want to go beyond. And what we showed is that it's actually an even greater challenge. So, the Paris Agreement, monumental agreement, it gets us about halfway to where we need to be to avoid dangerous planetary warming. It's a good start, but we have to improve on it. And at a time when the President of the United States is trying to back out of the Paris Agreement, we actually have to ratchet up our commitments in the years ahead if we're going to avoid dangerous warming. So it can still be done, but there is great urgency of action. And great urgency here in the United States of changing course. And we'll have an opportunity to do that in about 100 days if we choose to do that. The war on climate science, I've experienced it firsthand. I've been on the front lines. And sometimes the tales are rather amusing. As many of you know, 2 decades ago, as of Earth Day this year, the hockey stick curve became 2 decades old. We published it on Earth Day, April 22nd, 1998 in Nature. It's become this icon in the climate change debate, and that's made me a central target of those looking to discredit the case for concern about climate change. So I've had some amusing experiences. Sarah Palin back in 2009. You may remember the stolen emails. Sounds familiar. It's like WikiLeaks, Russia, stolen emails, trying to influence sort of U.S. and global politics. No, I'm not talking about Russiagate. I'm talking about Climategate. This was a test run for what we're seeing deployed today. Back in 2009, in an effort to scuttle the Copenhagen Summit, which was the first major opportunity in years for international cooperation on climate change. All these emails were stolen off a server in the UK, including emails of mine and many of my colleagues, and they were used and taken out of context to try to make it sound like scientists were cooking the books. It was used to discredit the underlying science going into the Copenhagen Summit. The first words out of the mouth of the Saudi Arabian delegate was that these stolen emails prove that climate change is I forget the exact word, but something to the effect of is a non-issue, and it will fundamentally impact these proceedings. So it was clearly intended to be used as a way to distract the public and policymakers and to attack the underlying case for concern. Sarah Palin at the time wrote an op-ed, in the Washington Post, where she claimed that experts were manipulating records and hiding the decline in global temperatures. I wrote a response to that 9 days later, pointing out everything that she had gotten wrong, the erroneous nature of essentially everything that she had said. And I have to say, it seems to have even gotten through to Sarah Palin, because a year and a half later, so these are her words. A lot of those emails obviously weren't meant for public consumption, and they could be taken out of context. They could be misinterpreted if taken out of context. Those are her own words. In response to a Freedom of Information Act demanding her personal emails from the time she was governor of Alaska. And then there's James Inhofe, who wanted to prosecute 17 climate scientists, including myself, including Susan Salman of MIT, a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Science, simply because we were promoting this, the supposedly discredited science of climate change. So we wanted to prosecute 17 of us. To those who remember the movie The Manchurian Candidate, which is really a parabola for our times, they came up with 57 communists in the House of Representatives. Inhofe couldn't come up with 57 scientists, but he did find 17 of us that he wanted to prosecute. Let me just say, James Inhofe was invited back in summer, July 2011, to be the keynote speaker at the Heartland Institute Climate Conference. The Heartland Institute is a front group. It was funded by tobacco interests in the past. It's funded by fossil fuel interests today, and it exists to try to discredit the science of climate change, to attack the science, to attack the scientists. And so naturally, James Inhofe, who's declared that climate change is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, would be a perfect person to keynote their conference. He accepted, but he had to back out at the last minute. He'd gotten ill swimming in the lake back in Oklahoma, his home state of Oklahoma, that was suffering from an algal bloom in response to the unprecedented heat and drought that Oklahoma was experiencing that summer, which scientists have demonstrated would almost certainly not have happened with the intensity that it did, if not for human-caused climate change. And then there's my good friend Ken Cuccinelli, former Attorney General of Virginia, who demanded all my personal emails from the time I was a scientist there, in an effort to find something to discredit me, to discredit the hockey stick, to make his funders, those who fund his campaign, fossil fuel interests, to sort of do their bidding. The Washington Post at the time it actually published 5 editorials blasting Ken Cuccinelli's witch hunt, as they called it, against me and the University of Virginia. And their award-winning cartoonist, Tom Toles, who I would go on to write a book with at the time, weighed in not once but twice about the matter. This is my favorite here. This Ken Cuccinelli up in the judge's chair. Poor Galileo down below. He wants to see his emails as well. I don't mind being compared to Galileo. I guess that's okay. It was quashed. Cuccinelli's effort was quashed by the lower court on a technicality. He had failed to demonstrate any wrongdoing on our part in his 40-plus page filing in the court. He appealed to the state Supreme Court, which actually rejected it with prejudice, meaning, don't come back here again with something like this. And so that was a battle that was won. But he wanted to be governor of Virginia. He ran for governor in the next gubernatorial race. I campaigned prominently and actively for his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, as you can see here in the final rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. McAuliffe was victorious. Ken Cuccinelli in defeat. I'm not making this up, folks. Went off to help run an oyster farm on Tangier Island. This is an island in the Chesapeake Bay that is slowly succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. You can't make this stuff up, folks. Climate change denial, thy name is hypocrisy, thy name is climate change denial. And let me finally tell the story of Joe Barton, who's perhaps best known now for texting inappropriate photos of himself to other individuals. And don't go online, don't Google this, because once you see the image, you can't unsee it. Don't do it. Please. But back in 2005, he subpoenaed all of my personal emails. Does this sound familiar? All of my personal emails. He was chair of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, looking for some way, of course, to discredit the iconic hockey stick, which was published in 1998, but somehow was responsible for the 1997 Kyoto Accord. I never quite figured out how that would work without a time machine. But, of course, consistency is not always present in these sorts of anti-scientific attacks. And so the various organizations like the AAAS, the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, the Journal Nature, all spoke out against what they saw as an obvious effort to intimidate a scientist whose findings might be inconvenient to the special interests who fund Mr. Barton's campaigns. He was one of the largest recipients in the House of Representatives of fossil fuel money. Somehow I don't think that's a coincidence. Well, you know, you might not be surprised that a progressive Democrat like Henry Waxman came out to defend us against these attacks. But what you might be surprised to learn is that the biggest heroes in this particular story actually turned out to be Republicans. Sherwood Bullard, who was an old-school pro-science, pro-environment Republican from New York, chair of the House Science Committee, who blasted Joe Barton's attacks against us, stopping just short of calling him out for modern-day McCarthyism. And you might recognize this guy as well, John McCain, who wrote an op-ed at the time where he said, you know, the message sent by the Congressional Committee to the three scientists, me and my two co-authors, was not subtle. Publish politically and palatable scientific results, and brace yourself for political retribution, which might include denial of the opportunity to compete for federal funds. It represents a kind of intimidation which threatens the relationship between science and public policy. That behavior must not be tolerated. That is one Republican talking to other Republicans. A pretty strong statement. And a reminder that there are some politicians of good faith and conscience on both sides of the aisle. And in this case, even though a lot of the sort of villains in my story have been Republicans, some of the major heroes have been Republicans as well. And I'm pleased that one of those heroes is going to be here later today. Lisa Murkowski, Senator Murkowski of Alaska, I consider to be one of those Republicans as well, who you know, is engaged in a good faith debate over what we do about problems like climate change. I'm running out of time, so you know, what do we do? What do we do about the problem? Well, we could just engage in all sorts of planetary scale interventions, shooting particles into the stratosphere, dumping things into the oceans, and you know, maybe we'll get lucky and it'll all work out. But the subtitle of our chapter on geoengineering is "What Could Possibly Go Wrong?" And I think that that really conveys the potential unintended consequences. You know, fortunately, there aren't any serious proposals by people in this administration, for example, that geoengineering is the way to solve this. Oh no, I'm sorry. Yes, Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, does think that geoengineering is the solution. You don't have to stop polluting the atmosphere with the burning of fossil fuels. We'll just engage in these unprecedented experiments with the one planet we know in the universe that can support life and hope that we don't screw it up even more. Well, of course, he's no longer there. So the path forward. We've made monumental progress. I already talked about Paris. Gets us sort of halfway to where we need to go. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it starts to help us bend that curve of carbon emissions down in the direction it needs to go. We need to improve on that. Of course, we've run into this wall. It's not the wall that Trump actually promised to build. It's the wall that he has constructed between himself and the evidence of human-caused climate change. And yes, we will all pay for it. That is certainly the case. Well, it's not just Trump, but of course the sort of scorched earth squad, the people he's appointed to key cabinet level positions, fossil fuel lobbyists and former CEOs and individuals like Scott Pruitt, who is no longer there, who have done everything they can do to dismantle essentially 50 years of progress in dealing with environmental problems, including policies that were put in place by former Republican presidents like Nixon and Bush, both Bushes and Reagan. What can we do in the face of that sort of challenge, this monumental challenge we face? Well, we can speak out. We all have voices, and we can make those voices heard, and I've done so in pretty much every way that I can think of. And we can try to influence those that we know who are in positions of authority. I'm proud that Terry McAuliffe, who I campaigned with, was one of the first governors to say, after Trump threatened to withdraw from Paris, to say, we're staying in. We don't care what Trump does. We're still staying in. And Terry said to me, in response to that, he said, well, elections do have consequences, and personal connections have consequences as well. Individuals can make a difference, and of course, the stakes couldn't be greater. We do face this monumental challenge to preserve the planet for future generations. It will, as Barry Gold pointed out, that statement, the decisions we make within the next 5 to 10 years, I would modify it a bit. The decisions we make right now, because we've lost that 5 to 10 years, it's right now. The decisions we make now will determine whether we can prevent catastrophic climate change and further environmental degradation. If we don't like the path that we're on right now, the good news is in less than 100 days, we can express our voices. We can express them at the voting booth, and we can say out loudly and affirmatively that we want to go in a different direction. And there's nothing more important that we can do right now than organize and help get out the vote. I agree with, I'm going to forget who it was, George Will. I don't always agree with George Will, but when I do, it's usually because of what he said recently. He has advised people to vote for Democrats in the midterm election, even though he's a longtime loyal Republican, because he understands the threat that we're under right now. So anything that we can do to organize around this upcoming election, to vote, make sure other people do, we have this amazing opportunity to change course. And there's still time. There's still time to prevail in this challenge, but we can't lose another 1 or 2 years. And so I'll leave it on that note and be happy to field questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your work. Really, really great presentation. My question is one of metrics. We have the temperature problem. We clearly have a temperature problem. We have a CO2 problem. CO2 problem, most would say, causes the temperature problem. Do we feed into the deniers by using, well, it's a 2, 5, or 10 degree Fahrenheit change since the Industrial Revolution, which is 1/10 of a degree per year, and it's sort of hard to argue about, versus using another metric, which in my lifetime, it's gone up by 35%, the CO2 level in the atmosphere. You can't fake that.
Oh, no, these scientists, they can fake anything. They're out there cooking books. We've even got the ice sheets to play along with our agenda. It's amazing.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for your work. But I just think the measurement of CO2 and the fact that it's gone from under 300 ppm to over 400 ppm, it eliminates the debate, doesn't it?
Yeah, so, there is another talk that I give where I show those graphs, and they're quite compelling. This is a different sort of talk where we're trying to use satire and humor to talk about the problem. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not just the CO2 or the global average temperature, it's the impacts that that's having right now. And so I really try to convey in my public presentations the remarkable increases we're seeing in truly destructive extreme weather events, because that's where the rubber hits the road. It isn't in, a degree or a warming of the global average temperature, but all of the impact that is leading to. And I sometimes remind people that temperature changes smaller than the one that we're facing now were the difference between North America with an ice sheet covering half of it and the world we live in today. So small changes in the average temperature of the Earth can have very profound impacts on global sea level and on extreme weather events, as we can now see. As I said before, the impacts are no longer subtle. They really aren't. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. I think it's critical that we make that connection, and we get newscasters and meteorologists to make that connection, because it doesn't happen often enough. In the last couple of weeks of record heat and unprecedented extreme weather events, there was a study recently that looked at how many news articles or segments mentioned climate change, and it was minimal, it was tiny. We have to get journalists and editors to make those connections, because they do a disservice to the discourse by not helping us connect the dots.
Senator Whitehouse has a question.
Mike, you're one of the leading scientists of our time. The science of climate change is extremely robust and extremely well established. I think every one of the scientific societies of all of the major scientific disciplines has signed up and said, yep, this is the real deal. So on the side of science, we seem to have this enormously powerful, widespread, well-established sort of armada of fact. On the other side, you've got these oddball types who have huge personal conflicts of interest and who are often speaking demonstrable nonsense. And yet, they've kind of fought us to a tie, which suggests to me that there is an apparatus differential between the apparatus that supports their efforts to mislead up against the communications capability of the scientific establishment. And I would like to hear your thoughts on what the scientific world needs to do to adapt to having this new and very persistent predator in its midst.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Senator. It's a very important question. And you're right, the sort of forces of anti-science, these fringe individuals, as you say, are not actual leading scientists, don't even make logically sensible arguments, and somehow they've had this prominence in our discourse. At least none of them have risen to the level of being the chief executive of the, no, I guess they have, I take that back. I mean, we have that sort of thinking now in the White House itself, and so how can that be? How can it be that 99% of the scientists, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, for the conservatives who are unwilling to listen to what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, operates under the United Nations, has to say. As Senator Whitehouse just said, every scientific organization in the U.S. and Europe, around the world, that's weighed in on this. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which was founded by a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, to assess policy-relevant science. All of the world's scientists are in full agreement about the reality and threat of climate change, and yet in our media discourse it's treated almost as a 50-50 proposition, and scientists are on the defensive simply for doing their work and publishing it in leading journals and trying to communicate it to the public are attacked and vilified. Why is that? Well, Senator Whitehouse, I think it's a rhetorical question to some extent, because we know why. It's because there are literally hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent by fossil fuel interests and conservative groups, the Koch brothers and various plutocrats, to poison our entire public discourse over human-caused climate change. I sometimes wonder, if it turned out that the existence of black holes was a threat to the fossil fuel industry, We would have black hole denial. I mean, there are these things that nobody can see. They're millions of light years away, and yet the public is perfectly willing to accept that these things exist because there haven't been hundreds of millions of dollars spent to try to convince them that it's bunk. In the case of climate change, which is, in my view, actually more established science than the science of black holes, what we face is the most well-funded, most well-organized public relations campaign, disinformation campaign in the history of human civilization. And in that battle, scientists, it's like the scientists are the Boy Scouts fighting the Marines in that battle. And fortunately, there is more of a discussion taking place today. Various scientific societies and public interest groups coming together and trying to find ways that we can help the scientific community. That we can assist scientists like myself and my colleagues, both in defending them against these attacks and in helping them be more effective in getting their message out. We need some balance. Right now, the playing field is hugely skewed where, you have the fossil fuel industry spending hundreds of millions of dollars to poison our discourse, and there's very little support or resources for helping the scientists do their work. So I would say, this is a conference about leaders, and I know there are a number of real leaders here today in the business community and elsewhere. We can use your help. If there are ways that you can help scientists, if you can help to fund some of the efforts to assist scientists in this battle, those resources will go a long way. So thank you.
Thank you very much.